What's up everybody, it's Greg Peters with the Car Passion channel here, and today's video has absolutely nothing to do with cars. But I will be doing a build from the bare block. That bare block just happens to be a PC case. So this thing is either gonna light up like Nyan Cat's uncle, or it's gonna burn my house down. Now I feel like this build does relate to the channel in a couple ways. The most obvious one is that I'm building myself a new editing setup, and I'll overview my current setup a little later in the video. But on a fundamental level, I'll be building a PC for the first time, the same way that I've done many automotive projects for the first time here on the channel, and I've really enjoyed the experience of documenting them, sharing my journey, as well as getting feedback from the community. Now I've been working off of a laptop for the last 15 years or so, and 3 weeks ago, I knew next to nothing about building custom PCs, and I'm the kind of person that when I get into something, I go down the deepest of all rabbit holes. And over the last 3 weeks, I've consumed over 200 YouTube videos from various creators in the space, learning everything I possibly could about this hobby. Because it's really quite an investment, and I want to make sure I do everything as good as possible the first time around. Now I knew about computer specs in general, like RAM speed and CPU cores and all that kind of stuff, but when it came to compatibility, fitment, reputable brands, if you have a certain budget, where should you be spending more money versus cutting costs? I honestly felt like I was piecing together a turbo kit for the first time on my Miata, constantly worrying about buying some expensive part that wouldn't fit or making some mistake that I couldn't undo, which I very well might do today. We'll have to find out. Now, if you're not interested in a computer build video, I fully understand that. But if you want to hang out for a chill production with the quality you've come to expect from Car Passion and maybe learn a couple things about building custom PCs along the way, let's jump into this thing. I'm going to kick things off with the component selection, and you already know I'm going to be flooding this video with car references, so let's start off with the power supply. Think of this as your fuel pump. Going too big is not going to cause any issues, but going too small is a big problem. This Lian Li unit can supply up to 850 watts and will easily be able to provide enough power to all my components with a little extra headroom in case of upgrades down the road. And you can figure out how big of a power supply you need by using a website like PC Part Picker. Now this one might be reaching a little bit, but the way I think of RAM is like the compression ratio in a turbo build. It provides instant access to crucial data, aka instant throttle response you get before the turbo spools up, while bigger workloads are handled by the hard drive, aka the boost from the turbo once it arrives. Having too much RAM doesn't really hurt anything other than your wallet, and it's essentially overkill depending on what you use your computer for. I went with the 64GB kit from Corsair, which also has some cool lighting for maximum street cred. Here we have the CPU. Think of the CPU as the engine in a car. Generally speaking, the faster your CPU is, the faster your computer will be, except specifically for gaming, but I'll talk about that shortly. There's a couple pieces of data here that tell you how fast the CPU is. The generation, which is essentially how old it is, and the performance level. Each generation has multiple performance levels. For example, the CPU in my new build is an Intel i7, which is the second highest level in the lineup. My 6-year-old laptop also has an i7, so what gives? I'm not even upgrading, or... Well, the difference is the generation. My laptop has a 7th gen i7, which was released in 2017. What you're looking at here is a 14th gen i7 released at the end of 2023. Think of this kind of like comparing an early 2000s Mustang GT to a current Mustang GT. Even though they're the same trim level, the older car only makes 260 horsepower, while the new one puts out a whopping 470. Anyways, on to the GPU, or graphics card. Now this is responsible for rendering graphics, and the more powerful it is, the smoother games will run on higher settings. I'm calling it right now, this thing is like the turbocharger of the computer world in multiple senses. The most obvious being, it's the #1 thing everyone wants to show off and glorify. How big is the turbo on that car? What GPU does your computer have? They're basically like saying the same thing. The high-end versions of these also cost just as much as big turbos, with some of them topping whopping $2,000. Now I'll talk about the total build cost of this PC a little bit later in the video, but we still have a lot of parts to get through. The GPU also bears similarities to a turbocharger in that it works in conjunction with the engine of the PC, aka the CPU, and you always want to match comparable levels of CPU and GPU. A high-end GPU paired with a budget CPU is like having a massive state-of-the-art turbocharger on a small inefficient engine. The turbo itself will be held back by the engine's lack of performance. Similarly, running a cheap graphics card with the high-end CPU is like having a racing engine in your car and choking it down with the wrong size turbocharger. So how big is my turbo? I'd say it's mid-sized. I had no reason to go ultra overkill here as I'm not building like a crazy gaming machine, but I wanted something that could handle an assortment of my favorite games without breaking a sweat. We'll get into a little dyno testing, aka benchmarking, once I get this thing built. One of the many things I learned on my educational journey is that most PCs, unlike laptops, don't have the necessary equipment to connect to Wi-Fi, which is so weird to me in 2024. But anyways, here's an inexpensive little kit that will allow that to happen. And on the off chance that one of you out there is getting ready to build your own PC in 2024, I do have all of my exact parts listed in the description below. Here is my hard drive, which is where all of the files, games, videos, operating system, and literally everything on the entire computer is stored. This one can hold 2 terabytes, which is the equivalent of about 1,000 of the video you're currently watching. I couldn't really think of a car part this is similar to, maybe like the gas tank or something. Fans are what you see on your screen right now, and if it wasn't obvious, these play a big part in keeping the system cool. Cool like cold, and cool like awesome, because these things are also packed with all kinds of LEDs, so I can go full Fast and Furious on this build. Yes, I spent a lot on lighting to make this thing look rad, and I really hope it pays off. These fans are also by the company Lee. Okay, that is the last time I will be doing that, I promise. Anyways, they can be tuned to spin faster or slower or stop completely based on how hot the components of the computer are. I bought many of these fans so I could fill up all of the available intake and exhaust slots, as well as using them on my water cooler. Oh yeah, this baby's gonna be water cooled. Now specifically for the intake fans, I got the reverse blade version. Now this is essentially like Garrett's line of reverse rotation turbochargers, which have no difference in performance, but are all about packaging in twin turbo applications. In my case, I got the reverse blade variants of these fans, so all of the intakes and exhausts face the same direction inside the case, which make for an extremely clean and uniform look. Otherwise, the intake fans would all be facing downwards like this, and you would just be looking at the cage on the back of the fans. A small detail, yes, but I think it's going to be worth all the effort in the final product. Here is the aforementioned water cooler, or AIO as it's known in the PC world, standing for all-in-one. It consists of a radiator, water pump, and fans, just like the cooling system in a car, and its job is to remove heat from the CPU. I picked up this Corsair unit for a few reasons. Number one, I think water cooling a computer is freaking cool, and I don't really feel like I need any more reasons than that, but I do know that the CPU I chose is a somewhat high-end unit, which means it produces a lot of heat when it's working at full speed, the same way a high horsepower engine does. So I wanted to make sure I could keep it nice and cool. Now, I did go a little extravagant on this unit in that it may or may not include a completely unnecessary LCD screen on the water pump that can display system telemetry and custom images and GIFs. Yes, that's right, I pronounce it GIF, not GIF. I also like pineapple and anchovies on my pizza. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, please send it to thecarpassionchannel@gmail.com. The next component is the motherboard. This is essentially the ECU of the computer, and that everything connects to it, and it can control several different functions of your hardware and software. Just like tuning an ECU can extract more power from your car's engine, you can use your motherboard to tune the CPU with overclocking, which makes it faster, but also generates more heat. The parallels between computers and the car world are just uncanny here. Maybe that's why I'm so hyped up on building a computer. Or maybe it's that coconut berry Red Bull that I just crushed. Either way, this is called the ASRock Z690 Pro RS, and I'd call it an upper mid-range board that's also one generation older than the current line, but it's gonna do everything I need it to. It looks good, it fits into my case, and it didn't break the bank. Again, this isn't like an endgame, top-of-the-line everything build. It's more of like going from a 6-year-old laptop to a modern PC, and the performance is gonna be 10x, even though the components are all mid-range type build, if that makes sense. Look, there's so much information that I learned in the last few weeks that I cannot even fit it into this video, otherwise it would be like 3 hours long. If you guys are building your own computer and you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments below and I'll try to answer. But just know that there are dozens of ultra high quality PC focused channels available on YouTube where you can learn all this stuff if you put the time in. I'll list my favorites at the end of this video so you can go ahead and look them up if you want to. Last but certainly not least, the chassis of the build, aka the case. This is also by Lian Li. It's called the O11 Dynamic Mini. It is not mini in any way, shape, or form, but it does have some cool features that I like, and oh, I almost just yeeted it off my desk. I think it's time to put that turntable back into my microwave where it lives, as I don't believe it's rated for this kind of workload. So here's everything in all its glory, and just like a workbench full of engine parts, it's finally time to start ham-fisting things together and do my best not to mess it all up. I actually am a little bit nervous for this, but I've been here before with plenty of projects here on the channel, and sometimes the best way to learn is just to jump right in. Before I do that though, I just want to show you the state of my current editing slash tuning slash gaming rig. So this is my Dell XPS 15, and it's a decently high-end laptop. It cost me about $1,500 back in 2018, but it's definitely reached a state of slow and steady cognitive decline, and doing something like opening Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Premiere simultaneously is definitely out of the question, mostly due to overheating and thermal throttling, which is basically like limp mode for computers. Now, I have come up with an interim solution for this problem. See, once the fans start spooling up on this bad boy, it sounds like it's about to lift off. Sorry. Anyways, once the fans start actually spooling up, I know it's going to get drastically slower. So what I have here is my external cooling device that I can rig up. And when there's a taxing load on the laptop and temps start getting real spicy, I can blast the internals with cool air, and as you can see, the temperatures instantly start dropping. But I'm kind of tired of dealing with all that, so what do you say we get started on building something with some forged internals? I'll start by tearing down the case to its bare form so it's ready to start accepting components. This thing is pretty sick. It's got glass side and front panels so you can really show off the build, hence why I bought so many things that light up and just generally look cool. It's got air filters for all of the potential intake locations, and as per usual, I'll be looking to upgrade these to K&N units later on down the line. Seriously though, these are just designed to help with controlling dust so everything inside the case stays clean. Here I'm removing what is known as the hard drive cage that can store traditional disk type hard drives, but I won't need that for this build, so I can take advantage of that mad weight reduction and extra space for cable management, aka wire tucking. It also came with so much hardware that it's got its own organizer, and hopefully I can figure out what half of these screws are for, but until then, here's some crispy ASMR. I'm actually considering doing a full ASMR version of this video, but I haven't quite decided yet. Next up, it's time to prepare the motherboard, starting with the CPU installation. Now, the motherboard CPU socket determines what type of CPU you can use, so you need to make sure those parts are compatible. Mine is known as an LGA 1700 socket, which is for Intel CPUs, and it means there are 1700 pins on this bad boy, so you don't want to mess up the install, otherwise you might bend one, which is not good. The CPU has a couple various cutouts as well as a tiny triangle which lines up with the triangle on the protective socket cover so you don't install it upside down. So just release this lever, open up the socket cover, and set your CPU into place, making sure all the little cutouts line up perfectly. Push the cover back down, which will force this protector to satisfyingly fling off, and lock the lever back into place. And yes, it was a bit terrifying bending this lever down and forcing it into place over a $400 computer chip, but everything turned out just fine. Next up is the hard drive installation. Now this is super easy. The SSD just slips into the socket at a slight angle and is held down by either a screw or an aluminum cover, depending on your motherboard. Many boards also have multiple SSD slots, so make sure the one you're using is the correct slot if you only have one SSD in your build. For the RAM, if your kit only uses 2 sticks, you need to pay attention to what slots they go into. There are typically 4 available slots, and you would use number 1 and number 3 on most motherboards. Otherwise, you'll only get half the performance out of your RAM. I went with the 4-stick kit, which is basically unnecessary because you can just spend less money and get the same 64 gigabytes of RAM with only 2 sticks, but I wanted to fill all 4 slots because I just think it looks cooler. This type of RAM is called DDR4, and it's one generation older than the most current technology, which is DDR5, and that's another compatibility consideration when choosing your motherboard, as they either accept DDR4 or DDR5 type RAM. To install the sticks, first open up the latches on the RAM slots you're using, slide the stick into the fixed side of the slot, then push down on both sides until you feel a firm click and the latch locks into place. You can see here all 4 sticks are evenly seated into the board, and you'll be able to verify that you have full RAM speed later on when you set up your system. Now, what I won't bog this video down with is the fact that I fully installed the motherboard at this point, and I had to remove it because I forgot or didn't realize that something had to be done prior to installation. And this happened twice, but I'm going to save you that headache and let you know that you need to install the CPU cooler backing plate before you put your motherboard in. This just sticks to the back of the CPU socket, and it provides threaded holes that you'll use later on. The Wi-Fi chip, if you have one in your build, is installed using the same exact method as the hard drive. Just slip it all the way into the socket at a slight angle like this, and it gets held in with a single screw. It is now time to install the motherboard into the case. My case in particular is designed to work with smaller types of motherboards known as mini ITX and micro ATX, but mine is the larger standard size board known as just ATX, so I need to add on this little extension plate that came with my case. This is the backing plate that houses all of the motherboard ports like USB, speaker jack, keyboard and mouse plugs, and internet cables, and it just pops into place. If you're equipping your tower with Wi-Fi, now is also the time to install the Wi-Fi antennas. You can just remove these knockouts with a screwdriver, and the antenna mounts screw into place. The antennas then screw onto those, and on the inside of the case, you'll have a couple wires that will get connected to your Wi-Fi chip once the motherboard's installed. Speaking of that, it's finally time. The board goes flat against the inside of the case, and it's easy to align properly because all the plugs will line up with that backing plate. Secure it with the hardware that comes with the case, and remember that we're not torquing down head studs here. Pretty much all of the hardware in your computer just needs to be snug enough to hold the parts in place securely. My motherboard also came with an adjustable GPU support tab, so in case you're using a large heavy GPU, it won't sag and put extra load on the socket. I'll get that adjusted once the GPU is installed. With the motherboard installed, I can hook up the case cables now. These are for the built-in features of the case itself, i.e. the power button, headphone jack, and top USB slots. These are individually labeled and need to be plugged in according to the motherboard manual. The USB stuff you can't really get wrong. Here's a USB Type-C connector and a USB Type-A connector. On my board, both of these plug in right next to each other, and there's no other place they could possibly go. Just make sure the plugs are fully seated. And down at the bottom is the HD audio plug for the headphone jack. And over at the other corner is everything for the power button itself, which is the trickiest part since you're plugging individual pins in, so you need to make sure to double check that this is all done correctly. Now I'll plug in the Wi-Fi chip with these tiny little plugs. They can be a little bit tricky, but you'll feel a nice firm snap once they go into place. Now we'll install the power supply, and if you thought the last batch of cables was overwhelming, check this heap out. So this is known as a modular power supply, which means it comes with a whole bunch of cables and you only need to use what your system requires, which is actually pretty cool because it helps eliminate unnecessary cables flying everywhere. I told you we were going to wire tuck the engine bay on this beast. Power supplies also have their own cooling fan, so no need to add anything extra there. Just make sure the intake isn't obstructed by anything, and then the exhaust exits right out the back of the case. Now I will hook up the CPU power cable and the main motherboard power cable. Luckily, all of these are marked and the plugs are pretty much self-explanatory, but when in doubt, just consult the manual. Now, the CPU cooler, in my opinion, is one of the coolest parts of this entire build, no pun intended, and it does come with its own radiator fans, but I'm replacing those with the same Li & Li fans that I'm using in the case, so everything looks uniform. The first step to the install is attaching the fans to the radiator. These fans have a really cool feature that helps cut down on cables by giving you the ability to interlock them together and then plug a single cable into the end of multiple fans. Once they're all connected, they get secured to the radiator, and these are going to be intake fans, so I used 2 of the reverse blade variants here. And I know the radiator is going to sit somewhere over here, but I'm not exactly sure how high, so I'll leave those screws loose for now. The cooler comes with a variety of mounting hardware depending on your CPU, so be sure to use the correct stuff or the parts will not make proper contact with each other and they won't cool correctly. I have an LGA 1700 CPU, so those are the posts I need to thread in for mounting the cooler. Thermal paste is mandatory for your CPU cooler, and this does come with pre-applied paste, but later on I decided to remove it and apply my own just to make sure I got full contact. Tighten down the cooler in a cross pattern just like you would with the 4-lug wheel, and continue tightening until the screws bottom out. This will make sure the perfect amount of pressure is applied evenly across the surface of the CPU. And I'll have to do some wiring for that water pump and LCD face, but I'll save that for later. Right now I'm moving on to the main set of exhaust fans. As if I needed even more cables to figure out. So when you buy the triple fan pack, it also comes with a fan control box along with all of these optional cables, so you can run up to 16 fans and control the speed and lighting through the manufacturer software, or you could also have the motherboard control the fan speed and the software control the lighting. You have all kinds of options here. So I'll link 3 of these top fans together, get them screwed into place, and for the rear exhaust fan, initially I also linked it into the top 3 using a short extension cable for a total of 4 fans on one channel. Stay with me here, this will all make sense later. And per the instructions, this was okay, but I could not get the lighting to work on the 4th fan in the chain, so I ended up just plugging that single exhaust fan into its own channel. Now it's time to install the set of intake fans, which will go into the bottom of the case, and the idea here is that the case will pull fresh air from underneath and direct it out the top, going along with the natural movement of heat, which is upwards. The secondary goal is to have slightly more intake airflow than exhaust airflow, so the case will be very slightly pressurized. That's right, this thing is actually going to be boosted. The reason for that is if it was set up the opposite way, where the exhaust fans were stronger than the intakes, the case would have negative pressure and it would actually pull unfiltered air through all the cracks and crevices, increasing the amount of dust that comes into the system. So that's why I chose to make certain fans intakes and others exhausts. I've got a total of 5 intake fans, but only 4 exhausts, so that should result in positive pressure, which I'll be able to test once the system is running. Now forgive me, but I'm going to geek out for a second here because I'm actually a bit obsessed with heat transfer and airflow in general, and you will see here that 2 of the intake fans are actually restricted by the radiator, which will affect their ability to flow air. Also, that rear exhaust fan is pretty much unrestricted with no filter on it. Now this might mean that the case pressure will become negative, but in that scenario, what I'll be able to do is tune the fan speed curves of each bank of fans, so the intakes are always running, say, 10% faster than the exhausts, or whatever is needed to maintain that positive pressure at all times. I seriously just love tuning, no matter what type of equipment it's on. So here's that control box I was talking about, and as you can see, there are 4 different fan channels, and I'll plug 1 bank of fans into each channel here. Now, traditionally, if you were to fill a PC case with 9 RGB fans like this, you'd have 2 cables on each fan, one to control the speed and the other to control the lighting, for a total of 18 cables, which sounds like an absolute nightmare. But since these fans all link together and can be controlled through a single cable from each bank, I only ended up with 4 cables to manage here. And yes, I know I'm only showing 3, but as I mentioned before, that one exhaust fan ends up getting its own channel. Now let's get this CPU water cooling system finished off with a very crooked camera angle. Anyways, this is the LCD screen that just mounts directly to the water pump magnetically, and it has 2 main cables coming off of it. One is a tachometer cable for the pump, which plugs into the motherboard's CPU fan header, and then the big cable gets routed around to the back, and it runs to another control box, since this is a different brand from the fans, which means it uses a different software, which is kind of a bummer, but I kind of prioritize buying components with the features I wanted, rather than trying to buy just the same brand of everything. But hopefully I can get that all figured out later once the build is complete. Anyways, I'll wire up both of those control boxes later on. I'm saving all the wiring in the back of the tower for last, so I can do it all at once and try to keep it clean. Next up, I'll be bolting on the turbocharger of the PC, aka the graphics card. Start by removing this panel on the back of the case and unscrewing the second and third covers that you revealed. The GPU is going to plug directly into the motherboard, very similar to how the RAM sticks got plugged in. Make sure the latch on that one side is open. line the GPU up with the slot and push it firmly into place. I'm holding the back of the tower with my other hand that you can't see here. You'll feel it click into place and see that latch get closed. Then replace the 2 screws on the back that will now hold the graphics card in place and screw the original cover back on. Now I can go back and adjust and tighten that little GPU support tab as well. And as you can see, it is firmly held in place and will be kept safe in the likely event of a Southern California earthquake, but mostly if you just need to transport your computer. Now, although the motherboard can supply some power to the GPU, about 75 watts, this one can draw north of 320, so it does need a dedicated power cable, and that'll go to the power supply, so I'll get that hooked up now. And at this point, it's also time to plug in everything else. Now, this stuff is going to vary based on the configuration of your build, but I'll briefly overview mine here. This is the Lee control box for all the case fans. All 9 of them get plugged into this, and then the box itself gets plugged into the power supply via a SATA power cable and also gets plugged into a USB header on the motherboard. This is the Corsair control box for my water pump and LCD screen, and you can see it's also got a bunch of other open ports. That's if I was running Corsair fans, which I'm not. Those would plug into this box as well. This also gets power from a SATA cable going to the power supply and plugs into another motherboard USB header. There's actually 2 USB plugs, one from the control box and one directly from the water pump. Those both get hooked up to this USB splitter, so it only takes a total of 1 header on the motherboard. Just a small detail. Here you can see both boxes are now plugged into the motherboard, and that is how the software will control the fans, the water pump, and the lighting. And that is it for the wiring. Now, I know it looks a little messy from here, but the cool part is all this gets completely covered up, so you end up not seeing any of it. This thing is looking cooler than I could have ever imagined, and it's time to reinstall all the panels and throw in a few satisfying plastic peels. Now, this is the point where whether I've built an engine, a computer, or anything else with expensive moving parts, I pretty much just want to mount it on the wall, never fire it up, essentially preventing anything from ever going wrong. But just like the Miatas, that is not the reason I built this thing, so let's carry on with the inevitable first fire up. Okay, just built my first computer following a couple YouTube tutorials. So this thing is either gonna light up like Nyan Cat's uncle, or it's gonna burn my house down. Either way, gotta film the first startup. I'm pretty much as nervous as firing up a freshly built engine right now, okay? I have no idea what's gonna happen. Hopefully there's no fire. It's not hooked up to a monitor or anything, I just wanna see if it all powers on. Okay, nothing happened. Oh, something's happening. Lights are happening. Oh my God. Oh my goodness. Don't worry, I did not build it to create a giant rainbow flare. I'm gonna be customizing this bad boy and all the lighting and stuff once I get it figured out. Looks like we got ourselves a computer, boys. Let me shut the lights off here. Oh man, that looks sick. Not a huge fan of the RGB vomit specifically, but just saying the whole lighting setup. Ooh, we have no lights on the exhaust fan. I don't even know what else I'm looking for. I guess I just gotta plug it into monitors. I gotta get Windows installed. I gotta do some configurating, which I am not gonna do in this video because there's a million videos from people who know way more than I do about computers on how to configure your setup once you get it all fired up. This thing has a dang check engine light already, and I just built it. I figure out what the heck is going on with this thing now. I guess I should hook it up to a monitor and actually get it set up. Yeah, so that check engine light actually turned out to be a little bigger deal than I thought it was going to. I actually had to get my entire water cooling system warrantied, which did go smoothly, but it took a couple weeks to get all sorted out. And I figured it would take a little while, so in the meantime, I just ran down to Best Buy and bought the cheapest available air cooler. That way I could get Windows installed, troubleshoot any random issues, and do a little benchmarking to compare my new build against my laptop. Don't worry, I do get the water cooler in this video and it will be fully installed and completed. Alright, so I have my new computer here hooked up to my left monitor, and my laptop is hooked up to my right monitor, and I've got a program on each computer called Cinebench, which is basically like a dyno test for your CPU. So I'm going to drag race these computers right now by launching the test at the same time, and the goal is for the CPU to render this image as quickly as possible. This is basically like watching a stock 1.6 liter Miata race a turbocharged 1.8. It's not even in the same realm of performance. The new setup was done in 24 seconds, and my laptop legit took almost 5 minutes to perform the same task. And full disclosure, my laptop was definitely in limp mode or thermal throttling for most of the test because it just cannot keep itself cool during stressful tasks anymore. But even with both CPUs working at full speed, the CPU in the new computer runs about 50% faster than the one in my laptop. And all that stuff is checkable by using software that shows how fast the CPU is working during the test, but I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here. The main thing I just want to show off visually was that little drag race. Now it's time for a straight up dig race with the graphics cards in these machines. And although my laptop is no slouch with a dedicated NVIDIA graphics card, I have a feeling the new system, with the GPU half the size of the laptop itself, might just have a tiny advantage. But let's see how it goes. So this test is called the superposition benchmark, and it displays an animation on screen while monitoring the maximum frame rate that the GPU is capable of. So I'll set both computers up identically and launch the test. And as you can see, we are not off to a good start here, as the laptop is taking exponentially longer to even start the test. It's pretty clear to see how clicky the animation on the right side is, and that's because the laptop is absolutely struggling to hit an epic 7 frames per second, while over on the left, the tower is pumping out north of 80 FPS on the same exact test. And fun fact, the video that you're watching right now was shot in 24 frames, so you actually can't even see how smooth it is. In fact, my monitors are only 60 Hertz, which means they refresh 60 times per second, so I can't even tell how smooth it is. Anyways, that's enough dyno testing. My replacement AIO finally came in, which means it's time to install it, set up some lighting effects, and see if this thing actually came out as cool as the vision I had before starting the build. Spoiler alert, it did. So I had this whole black and purple theme planned out from the beginning, and seeing it come to life is pretty epic. You can see on the LCD that not only can you display a GIF, but you can cycle through multiple pictures, GIFs, and system telemetry displays. Here we got Gengar doing his thing, which obviously goes with the whole color scheme. And when I get bored, I can just load up another lighting profile. Here we see the Red Beast doing its thing in the canyon, along with the channel logo, which I thought was pretty sick as well. But as cool as all this is, as good as it looks, and as well as it did in the performance tests, there's one question that's far more important. Can it run Doom? And of course it can. Now, I'm not a big time gamer, but I certainly wanted something that wouldn't struggle to run some of my favorites, both new and old, such as Toe Jam and Earl, Kerbal Space Program, Trackmania, and BeamNG. That blow-off valve is so beautiful. And there is one real-world test that still needs to be done. Will I be able to open both Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Premiere at the same time? Now, even though I knew that wouldn't be a problem, I'm still floored that I'm able to not only have both programs open, but actually work in Photoshop while Premiere is in the middle of rendering a 4K video. So how much did all of this cost? What would I do differently? And where did I learn all this stuff anyways? So the total for this build was $2,276.38. And honestly, I wouldn't do a single thing differently. I'm stoked on how it came out. You could, however, get identical performance to this machine for somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,750 if you were to use a cheaper case, fans without lighting, an air cooler rather than a water cooler, and a 2-stick RAM kit. But I wanted this thing to look really good and have some extra features to play with. I used both Amazon and Newegg to source all of my parts, and you can find everything linked down in the description below for this build. Sites like PC Part Picker and Newegg's PC Builder can help you ensure you're choosing parts that are compatible with each other, but the biggest help of all were easily the YouTube channels that are dedicated to this hobby. The ones I found most helpful are listed on screen right now, but my favorites are definitely Jay's 2 Cents and Gamers Nexus. And there is so much more that goes into PC part selection than I initially thought, so if you plan to take on this endeavor yourself, take your time in your research. You won't learn everything in an hour, but if you give it a few weeks, I say with confidence that if you can change your timing belt, you can build a PC. Well, everybody, that was a video about how I built my new computer. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, I feel like there is a lot of crossover between building computers and cars. You know, you got to put stuff together in the right order. You learn about component compatibility. Heat management is obviously a huge issue, and I'm absolutely obsessed with how this thing looks. I think it's going to make a great editing rig for whatever I come out with in 2024. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace out.